Well, this is Sydney, and me and Sydney are going to show you how to make a tablet cover. I've already made a larger one. This is a netbook cover. So we're going to go kind of along these lines, which is a little bit shabby chic. What I've actually done with the picture on the fabric is print out from a PC onto printable fabric, and you'll be quite surprised when you iron that with a hot iron with no steam. It actually seals the ink, so you can actually wipe it clean as well. But I'm going to make the smaller version. So first thing we need to do, get rid of the cat, is to measure my tablet. I've only got a small tablet, but it doesn't matter the size of yours because you're going to measure from the tablet itself. So I'll need a few strips of fabric. I've got some wadding to make it nice and padded. The front of my fabric is going to be just plain calico because this is what I'm going to add lots of bits of fabric and lace to. And then I've got the back of my tablet case, which is some floral tilde fabric, and then that's going to be my lining. So if I just take my calico piece first of all, and roughly measure around it. Now I need a gap of around about 1.5 inches. Doesn't have to be exact, all the way around because I want it to be nice and snug. But then an extra little bit at the top of the back because that's going to fold over. So 1.5 inches all the way around the tablet for the front piece. The second piece is going to be a little bit longer to go on the back. And this is where my cutting mat and ruler comes in handy. So I can still need to cut on that line. And again, just sit that nice and neatly round about there. And as long as it's square and not too snug, it doesn't matter if it's a little bit too big. So that's my front panel. I'll need a piece of wadding cut to the same size. And this is just a natural wool batting, it's really soft. Now what I'm not going to do is use my rotary cutter because it tends to push all of the fibres from the wadding into my mat. And then it's a big clean-up job, so I'm going to cut around this with scissors. I'm not going to bother pinning it because the friction on the fibres holds the fabric down to use as my template. So that's my front panel. My back panel is going to be a little longer. So I'm still going to use that fabric as a template. I'll cut off the selvage of the fabric first of all. Always cut off your selvage, that's the bit down the side that has the name of the fabric on it, because it's normally woven slightly differently to the main fabric. And besides that, it's got little holes in it. Use that as the template across the bottom, and I'm going to go 4 inches longer. Straight at the start. Any excess can be trimmed away afterwards, so don't worry about this being absolutely perfect at the moment. 1, 2, 3, 4 inches longer at the top here. And you can see the way this is starting to build now. So there's my front panel, that's my back panel. The back panel will fold over on top of the front panel, and that's what's going to fasten it. I'm going to use a piece of elastic and sew a button around the top to fasten it over. You could maybe put a ribbon on there if you wanted to. But I'll need another piece of wadding to the sides of the back. Oops. And again, I'm cutting this with scissors so I don't spoil my cutting mat. So for those of you that have a 7-inch tablet, which is what I'm working for here, my fabric for the back of my tablet measures 14 inches long by 8 inches wide, and then the front of my fabric measures 10 inches long by 8 inches wide. One piece of fabric for the front, backing wadding the same, piece of fabric for the back, and a backing wadding the same. Now I need to cut a piece of lining fabric to exactly the same size as those two. So I think we'll have a little bit of fun first though. We'll decorate the front. So this is my printed fabric. I'm going to cut that down. I've just printed off some pictures of sewing machines, but you could even put photographs on here. That would be personal. I'm just trimming away the excess. And that's going to lay at a jaunty angle across my fabric. So, here's my sewing machine. Oops. Now I'm just going to randomly sew this in place in no particular angle or measurement. And I'm just using a straight stitch that's just going to tack it in place. You won't see the stitches after. So that's my first strip. Then I think we'll have a strip of fabric. In fact, that can go underneath. And I'll put a piece of lace on top of that. I think the lace suits this kind of look and it suits this kind of colour. Lost my scissors. You could pin this, but for speed's sake I'm not going to. And I'm sewing straight through the calico and to the wadding as well, so that's going to help to keep the wadding in place. And I'm not worried that it doesn't fit perfectly at the moment because it's going to be trimmed down shortly. There you go. I'll have a darker piece underneath there. And again, just to hide the seam, so I don't have to bother sewing face to face and turning over, I'm just going to pop a piece of lace straight over the top of that seam. And I'll have a different style of lace. You can see it's building up quite nicely, and I think the more you put on there, the more times of ribbons and fabrics, as long as they coordinate, as long as all of your colours match, then it really doesn't matter how much you put on it. And this is something that's not really going to go in the washing machine. Don't worry too much about what type of fabrics you're putting together. So one final piece across here at the bottom, with another piece of ribbon. and one more across the top. Then I think that's done. I'm going to sew this one in place and then put some lace over the top. That's how we are now. And one more piece of lace. Now the next thing I need to do is to move that out of the way and trim back all of the excess fabric so that it's square to the shape of the front piece. So turn that over, take your rotary cutter and your ruler again and simply trim away the excess. Normally I'd stand up to do this so I've got more pressure. Right, so that's the front now. Normally I'd press that, but again I haven't got the iron handy so I'm not going to. So that's how we're looking at the moment. Then I need to put the back on there, and remember I need to cut out some lining as well. So I'm just going to cut out 2 pieces of fabric, one the same size to the back and one the same size to the front, then we'll start piecing that together. Right, so that's the front, decorated, sewn through to the wadding. That's my lining fabric cut to the same size. That's the back of my case, and then the lining fabric again cut to the same size. Next thing to do is to put some bias tape across the front. So I'm just going to sew with a long stitch the lining to the top, just to tack it, just to hold it in place. So as close to the edge as I can. And again you won't see those stitches. And then I'm going to take my bias tape and cut a piece a little longer. It's always better to cut excess away than it is to be too short. Take my stitch length back down again to about 2.5. Now open up your bias tape. If you haven't applied this before, bias tape is fabric that's folded over in two and the back sides meet in the middle. So the way that you're going to pop that on is to lay it face down on top of your project, open up the tape. You can pin this if you want it to be really accurate, but basically I'm going to sew along that crease mark there. I just need to make sure that the stitch line is inside that rough tacking stitch that I made earlier. So open that up and sew. And then when I fold that right over the top, it gives a really nice, neat finish, and it saves you hemming. When you imagine if you've got your fabric and your wadding and your lining fabric, if you were to create a hem over the top of there, it would be very bulky. But by applying bias tape, it makes it really neat. What I'd normally do now is to hand sew the back of that with a slip stitch. But for speed's sake, I'm going to do it on the sewing machine, so I'll try and be quite accurate. So I need to fold that over and make sure that as I sew, I'm going to sew through both layers. I'm going to try and sew straight through the seam so you see as little of my stitch marks as possible. Thankfully my machine's got a guide on the front, so there's a little red mark to show me the line that I'm stitching in. So hopefully that'll be nice and neat. It'll be fine. I'll just cut away the excess now. Then what I need to do is to sew the front to the back and put my bias tape all the way around. So I'm just going to put that tacking stitch again straight across the top, purely to hold the fabric in place, so a longer stitch. So that's the back of my bag, that's the lining, and then I'll pin the front of the bag to the back. And you can see the way that it's starting to form. So when it fastens, I'm going to put a nice big button there, and that will fasten over the top like so. And I'm just going to put bias tape all the way around the edge. Now don't worry again if things aren't exactly square, because you can always trim the fabric back afterwards. So I'm just pinning to hold that in place. Then I'm going to put my long tacking stitch or basting stitch just to hold that in place, and then the bias tape goes on top. Trying to make sure that the fabric isn't puckering as I'm sewing that, and that'll make it a lot easier when I apply the bias tape. Back a bit. Just pop the lace under. Oops, that's upside down. Purely a tacking stitch, you won't see that, but it holds all of the layers in place. Now if you find at this point that the wadding travels a little bit, as it tends to, or your fabric's stretched a little bit, you can see the back of my fabric is a little bit wider now than the front. I don't know why, these things happen. Now I can just trim away the excess and make it square. You can do that with your rotary cutter if you prefer, but I'm not very much out, so I'll just trim that with scissors. And then just like I applied the bias tape across the front of here, I'm going to now sew that all the way around. Now when you're putting bias tape on that's going to meet, so I'm sewing in the full rectangle here, what I do find is that it's easier to go around a curve than it is a corner. So I'm going to curve away the corners here. You can do corners, you can miter the corners, but I just find this easier. And on the bottom section, both corners. And where you start, find a seam that's not going to be seen. So my bias tape that goes across the front, remember, is going to be underneath the flap. So I'm going to start applying my bias tape at the side. Open it up and fold it over, and that'll make it neat when you come to finish. So again, pin that if you're not very confident. Start with my needle down, oops, and a smaller stitch, So I'm on about 3mm, and then I'm going to sew all the way around just like I did across the top. Most of the way around with the bias tape. I just wanted to show you what happens when I get back to the beginning again. Now I'm going to cut the tape just over where I first started. Remember I folded that over? And follow that seam line, that crease line again, and then I'm going to line up that crease line with the row of stitches that I just started sewing with here. Like so. Next thing is to fold all of this bias tape back. I'm not going to worry about sewing that little bit by hand. You could do if you were pedantic, but that's going to be folded over and then over the top. For those of you that saw the cat at the top of this video and thought, where's the dog? He's here, you'll see him in just a second. So I'm going to fold that over all the way around. One thing that I am going to do is to trim away any excess, because again, for some reason your batting or your wadding grows. So I'm going to trim around the corner here, and the second corner, just cutting that round, because otherwise that bias tape is never going to go over the top. Around the top of the flap. And the second bit, and you'll find as you're sewing around as well, if you have got a little bit extra fabric, it really doesn't matter. But I'm going to sew this with a slip stitch, so I'm going to do that by hand. The beauty of bias tape is, with it being cut on the bias, it stretches a little bit. Shush! So you really can kind of manoeuvre it around those corner pieces. So for a slip stitch, I'll start sewing in red, although I wouldn't do that normally because it's the wrong colour, but I want you to see the stitches on here. So it doesn't matter where you start. I don't knot the thread to start with. I'm just going to go over this a couple of times. That's because the cat got the attention at the top of the video, is jealous now. Let's sew. Fold over your bias and do a little catch stitch underneath so it's barely visible. This is a slip stitch. Go in directly underneath your little catch stitch and through and back up into the bias tape. Around about 1/4 of an inch from where you're sewing. So normally you do this in the same colour thread that you're working with, but just so you can see, into the main fabric, up through, straight down into the main fabric, and just catch a tiny little stitch. So in essence all you're going to have are a few tiny little dots of thread. Now I prefer doing it this way because the stitches are practically invisible. If you wanted to machine stitch around the top of that, then of course you can do. But I'll carry on doing this and then we'll press it in just a second. There he is, look. The cat's disappeared. Alfie got all jealous, so he has to come and sit in his seat right next to me sewing. He's a good boy. He's a good boy. I've changed the thread for the right colour of thread, and I just wanted to show you again around the corner, or around the curve I should say. This is where bias tape comes into its own. Because it's cut on the bias, it has a little bit of give, it's got a bit of stretch. So manoeuvre it and pull it around the corner till it lays flat, but I am going to press this afterwards. And again, just that slip stitch. This is the bit that you're going to see because this is the top of the flap that curves over to close the case. So I'm trying to be as neat as I can there. But you know what? If your stitches aren't particularly neat, then there's no reason why. What? You can't just put some lace or something around the top of that, a little bit of ribbon to cover up your stitches would be absolutely fine. So I'll just carry on doing this. And we'll be back when we're finished. Won't we? Finished? So I put my bias tape all the way around. I've hand sewn it to the back of my tablet holder, and I've pressed it. When you're pressing it, because it's cut on the bias, again you can pull it and twist it just to make sure it lays flat. The next thing I did was to sew on a piece of elastic which is going to go around my button as a closure. And I like to put 2 buttons layered up together, so I measured the centre point and put 2 buttons together on top of there, just sewn all the way through. Shush! And where the elastic's sewn on the top, which is a little bit ugly, I'm just going to put a bow on the top. Now you can keep sewing and sewing by hand if you like, but I'm going to use some silicone glue. This is pinflow glue. It is pretty permanent. And pop my bow on the top. Because what I'm thinking is, this isn't going to go in the washing machine. So if you wanted to add any extra bits and bobs, maybe some more bows, maybe some more buttons or another bit of lace, you can glue it. It's not going to be a problem. So I'll just leave that to dry for a second and show you again the larger one that I made. This was obviously using a different colour of bias tape. I went to town a little bit more on ribbons and lace and extra buttons. Those are glued on, by the way. Put the thread through the centre so that it looks as though it's sewn. This was just a gathered piece of lace. I put a running stitch through it and gathered it up to make like a flower, and then just popped that in the centre. And again, there's my elastic to go around the button as a closure at the top. But with the one that I've just made for you, so that's my netbook. You can see that inside there, fits perfectly inside. So you can make these any size you like. You could even make it for a laptop. And then this is the one that I've just made. So in goes my tablet. That's going to stop it getting scratched. And then my elastic just goes around the button there to fasten it over. Oh, gone. And now we're all finished.